I attended a cocktail party with my wife Claire, a cocktail party being the fashionable term for a late happy hour among intellectuals, and I was happy because I had a very good scotch in hand, neat. Anyway, I sat quietly in the corner, observing my wife and the other people in the room. She was engaged in conversation with her mentor and friend, Professor Randy Holcomb. Her hand movements were subdued because she held a martini in one hand, but I could tell she was trying to convey some thought to the professor. To me, he seemed like a slick guy and a ladies' man, but I never voiced my personal dislike for him to her because I knew it would only lead to conflict. She believed the professor could do no wrong. Claire was a potential best-selling author. She had written several short romantic stories that had been published.
Welcome to the Dark Side channel. Dive into the world of human relationships, mistakes, and right decisions. Don't miss out. Subscribe and join our growing community.
And received good reviews. Over the past 2 years, she had focused on a historical novel and conducted extensive research on the time period to create a storyline, including political, social, economic, and geographical facts and issues. About 3 months ago, she had started writing her book in earnest, and I supported her efforts both financially and emotionally. She thought that within the next month or so, she would have a sufficiently finished book to submit for review to a publisher. She was still researching for the book, going to the library a couple of days a week, and meeting with the professor weekly. I was unhappy about her absence from home, especially around him, but I felt I should trust her without confrontation. My name is Jim Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, and I work for an engineering consulting firm in this area. Certainly not the most handsome guy, slightly balding, but I exercise and run, so I'm in fairly good shape physically. I'm paid well enough, and I have a professional engineer certificate, so I have no job security issues. Claire is 34 years old, fairly tall, slender, and quite attractive, though not a beauty. I thought her photo on the book cover would help its sales, but I could be biased. She possessed all the qualities I had always wanted in a wife: pleasant-looking, intelligent, self-assured, and loving. Although lately the love had waned a bit, and I attributed it to the long hours she spent on her novel. She never offered it for me to read, only allowing her mentor to read it. Being a professor of English literature, I assumed he was better at discerning its merits than I was, but it still irked me. Claire and I discussed the topic of children, and she agreed that someday she would want to have them. But first, she wanted to establish herself as an author. So I patiently waited for her book to be finished, but doubt started creeping in as time went by without a clear end in sight. I hoped that when this novel was completed, she would be ready to focus on our life together, as her biological clock was ticking, obviously. We were both only children, and our parents were starting to worry because grandchildren weren't on the horizon yet. If it took another 2 or 3 years before she was ready to have kids, they might never become grandparents, I thought. The event tonight was hosted by the Dean of the School of Arts, and I was here solely for Claire. I didn't mind these events, but they weren't my favorite. In college, I had to take English literature as an elective in my freshman year, but subjects preceding engineering took precedence over this one, and I'm afraid I didn't absorb much, enough to get a passing grade. The conversation here, as usual, focused on the latest book and the hottest new author, which wasn't on my list of personal interests. I knew enough just by listening to Claire, but in this environment, I felt out of place. When we first arrived, Claire and I went through all the rooms together and shook hands with most of the 20 or so people. As I mentioned before, now I sat quietly in the corner with my whiskey, observing what was happening in the room, enjoying the sight of my wife among her colleagues, and thinking about how great it would be if her novel became a bestseller. With only 2 small books to her name so far, she could mingle and socialize with people here almost on equal footing, but a bestseller would elevate her far above them, and she could revel in their envy and jealousy. She wasn't usually a very outspoken person, but being admired by colleagues would give her confidence in herself and her abilities. I smirked to myself, thinking about all the work she had put in and all the possibilities and scenarios that could arise if her novel made it all the way. At that moment, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement and saw Mrs. Holcomb, the professor's wife, approaching me. I inwardly groaned, hoping I could sit quietly without engaging with anyone, but it seemed that wasn't meant to be. Mrs. Holcomb was a matron I had spoken to briefly a few times, but I didn't know her well. "Jim, I noticed you're sitting here alone, and I told myself that it will never do for a person to enjoy themselves at one of these gatherings without company. It will give a bad reputation to such events," she joked, settling into the chair next to mine. "You've caught me, Mrs. Holcomb. Can I offer you a drink? Call me Jean, and I can't take alcohol, but I see you're enjoying yours. I've always maintained that a little scotch keeps the flies away, John. So what do you think about your wife's book? Randy says he thinks it'll definitely be a bestseller. I think he's a little jealous. I haven't been offered to read it, so I can't comment on the writing quality or the content. Well, I haven't read it either, but Randy is impressed. Your wife hasn't even discussed this book with you. Not a word. I'm starting to think she doesn't think I have anything to say about it, or what she would like to hear. However, I'm very proud of her for taking on the novel, and judging by your words, she's doing very well with it." All this time I watched Claire and the professor, who were still talking at the other end of the room. They had been talking for a while. As I continued to watch, they seemed to come to an agreement, and Claire looked around the room. I assumed she was looking for me, and when she noticed me, she started waving her hand, then presumably noticed Jean next to me. With what I could interpret as a worried look, she turned to the professor and said something to him. He looked in our direction and also gave us a strange look. Then they both hurried towards us, not saying a word. As they approached us, I wondered what could have alarmed them. Jean must have been watching them too, because she commented on their actions. "It seems we did something to worry our spouses." "It sure looks like it," I joked. "Maybe they think we're planning a romance." Jean faintly smiled at my clumsy remark. Reaching us, our spouses immediately started a nervous dialogue with us. "Hey, you two, what are you planning?" "See, I told you," I laughed to Jean. "What did you tell her?" Claire asked. "I told her you two surely thought we were planning an affair," I grinned at them. And Randy and my wife both seemed to pale a bit, but Randy recovered first. "Well, it did look a little suspicious, and we just wanted to make sure you two were behaving properly," he chuckled with a grimace. Jean asked, "Did you solve all the issues with Claire's book? It seemed like you talked it to death." "Oh, yes," Randy replied. "However, Claire's book doesn't have that many issues. She's on the right track and should get a good response when it's published." That's the end of our conversation. We nervously chatted together for a few more minutes, and then the professor turned to Jean. "I suggest we take a little walk, dear, and leave them alone. I have a busy day tomorrow." Standing up, Jean turned to me. "Thank you for the conversation, Jim. We'll have to do it again sometime." "Great, Jean. It was nice," I replied, turning to Claire, who was still standing silently. "Do you want to talk, or are you ready?" I asked. "I think we can go. It's been a long day and I'm tired." I got up, and after saying goodbye to the host and hostess, we headed home. On the way home, Claire was silent as I drove, giving me time to think about the reaction she and the professor showed when they saw Jean and me talking together. In a usual situation, I wouldn't have doubted trusting Claire, but something felt off, and I thought further conversation with John might clarify things. I decided to follow up on this next week. Wednesday morning, I managed to handle a bunch of work problems and called Jean to arrange a lunch meeting. She sensed something was off with our spouse's reaction to our evening meeting and readily agreed to meet me for lunch the next day to talk about it. We met at O'Charlie's restaurant on the highway, where we were unlikely to run into our spouses or anyone who knew us. First, we had lunch, and then we started talking. "You must have some concerns if you called this meeting," she said to me. "I think so, but I'm not sure how to proceed further." "Well, I have some concerns too, and they're stronger than yours. That's why I agreed to this meeting." She went on to explain, "A couple of years ago, I caught my husband having an affair with a grad student, and he swore he'd never do it again. I suspect he had relationships with other students before, but I had no proof. This time, I'll get evidence if he's involved with your wife, and I'll expose him. I'd like to suggest hiring a private detective and splitting the expenses. From what I know, it can be very expensive, and by sharing the costs, we can find out if something is going on. I also suggest the detective only monitors my husband. If he's not having an affair with your wife but someone else or not at all, I'll cover the expenses myself. If your wife is involved, we'll split the costs. Does that sound fair? I paused for a moment.
Yes, I can agree to that. When do you want to do this?
Right now. Are you free today at 3? I have an appointment with the investigator recommended by a friend who had a similar problem. All right, give me the address and I'll meet you there. I need to get back to work. At 3 o'clock, we met at the investigator's office, explained what we wanted, gave him the necessary information about our spouses, and Jean left him a deposit to start. He told us he would report to Jean weekly unless he needed to contact her sooner. As we left his office, we both sighed deeply. We were ready, and now all we had to do was sit and wait. This was the second hardest thing we had to do. The hardest would be behaving normally around our spouses. The week dragged on as Jim waited for news from Jean, knowing it would likely be a whole week before they found out anything, as he tried to avoid confronting Claire with his suspicions. She behaved like a normal, loving wife, except that their intimate life continued at a low frequency. Finally, the next Wednesday, Jean called and invited him to the investigator's office for the first report. Entering the office, the investigator invited them to sit down and pulled out a report from the stack on his desk. I know you're eager to find out what we've learned about Professor Holcomb's activities, and I'm sorry to report that your suspicions are correct. Professor Holcomb is having an affair with another woman. We tracked him to a motel in Ginsburg on Thursday and yesterday and met a young woman there. Each time they went into different rooms, but both times it was the same woman. I have photos here of them entering and exiting the rooms. He pushed the photos across the table to them, and Jim took one with trembling hands. Looking at it, he saw Professor Holcomb leaving the motel room behind a woman who turned to look at him. He couldn't make out her face, but her height, hair color, and style resembled Claire's. Grabbing another photo, the woman was facing the camera, and he realized it wasn't Claire but a younger woman. With a sigh of relief, he leaned back in his chair. He must have been very tense because his body seemed to relax into stillness, and his head momentarily hung down, freeing itself from the worry he had been feeling for over a week. Raising his head, he looked at Jean, who was silently and resolutely examining the photos one by one. When she finished looking at all of them, she turned to the investigator. "Can you get proof that they're really committing adultery in that room?" "Well, we could get photos, but you wouldn't be able to use them as evidence of adultery in court because it would be a violation of their privacy. If they were doing it in your home, you could use photos taken there. Your husband may understand this and not take her there. Why don't you talk to a divorce lawyer and get his recommendations?" "I think I'll do that. Please continue surveillance until I ask you to stop," said Jean, gathering up the photos and standing to leave. They left the investigator's office and headed to their cars, not speaking for several minutes. "I'm going to send you a check for half of this week's surveillance," Jim told her. "You don't have to do that. I'm really sorry you found out your husband was likely unfaithful, but I found out it wasn't with my wife. It means a lot to me, and helping to pay for this is worth more than any price, so I'll write a check and mail it to you." "Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it." We parted ways and I headed home. It wasn't until I drove for a few minutes that it hit me. Why were Professor and Claire so unsettled when they saw Jean and me talking together at the party? We still hadn't solved this puzzle, and there must be something we didn't know. Perhaps Claire could have an affair with the professor, but the week-long surveillance hadn't caught them yet. I suddenly felt relieved that Jean had instructed the investigator to continue surveillance. I needed to call her and share my thoughts to ensure she didn't stop the work without informing me. It was strange that despite all my conversations with Jean, we hadn't stumbled upon anything remotely indicating any careless actions on Claire's part. Another week passed, and we met with the investigator again. This time, there were the same photos with the same girl. The investigator found out she was another graduate student, and Jean decided to file for divorce based on irreconcilable differences, as the lawyer told her that we lived in a state where there's no fault. So discovering evidence of marital infidelity wouldn't affect the outcome of the legal process. Marital property would be split 50-50. He would pay alimony as John didn't work, but there wouldn't be child support since their kids were already adults. I wrote her a check for half the cost of surveillance, and we parted ways. I still didn't know why our spouses had behaved so upset at the party, but now I was sure that Claire hadn't had an affair with the professor. But what happened? I needed to figure it out, and hiring investigators to watch our spouses was expensive. So maybe I should set up surveillance myself. I needed to think about it. Lately, our intimate life had slowed down significantly, and I thought that if everything was fine and I didn't suspect she was playing games, I would comment on it. I decided to say something that wouldn't make her suspect I had trust issues with her, but might ease her conscience if she had any. That evening after dinner, I opened up about my concerns. "Sweetheart, is everything okay with you? Are you feeling all right?" I asked her. "I'm feeling fine. Why do you ask?" she replied, frowning slightly with mild irritation. "Because lately you've been giving me a lot of excuses for not wanting intimacy, and I thought maybe you're not feeling too well. Maybe you should see a doctor." She paled slightly for a second, and I felt a slight euphoria from having reached her conscience. "No, I feel fine. I told you that. But I didn't realize I was avoiding you. I'll try to be better to be around you. But I've put so much effort into the book, preparing something to submit to the publisher, that lately I just can't focus on anything else. I understand, honey. You know how much I love you and I'm proud of you, so I worry about you. Love-making should be beneficial for relaxation, and I'm always ready to help you unwind." I smiled at her. She smiled back slightly. "We'll see." Then she approached and gently kissed me on the lips. Taking my hand, she led me to our bedroom and started undressing. I watched her for a moment and began undressing too. It was surreal, but I didn't feel like she was making love with all her heart. It seemed like she was just doing it to please me, or more accurately, to silence me and ease her conscience. Maybe I satisfied her, but I wasn't sure. She seemed to react right, but when we finished, I didn't feel like she was satisfied. There was an empty feeling in my chest. After I got up, she went to the bathroom to freshen up, then came back, said, "Good night, darling," and lay down next to me, her back turned. There were no hugs, as we usually did after lovemaking, and I realized that everything had changed. The next morning, I left for work at the usual time, while Claire was still in bed. Driving away from home, I stopped the car and called the office on my cell phone to say I wouldn't be in that day, then headed to the nearby car rental agency. On such days, Claire usually went to the library to continue her research. Renting a car, I returned to our street and parked where I could watch our house from afar. Around 9 a.m., I saw Claire leave the garage and drive away from me towards the university library. I followed her at a distance. She parked right by the library, and as I parked, she left the car and entered the building. I trailed behind her for a few minutes, but knew where she spent most of her research time, and found her there as she prepared to view microfiche. Hiding behind a nearby stack, I could watch her, pretending to be interested in a large reference book. After half an hour, another woman joined Claire, and when Claire saw her, she stood up and they hugged. To my surprise, as a greeting, they lightly kissed each other on the lips. Now I was completely baffled, but kept observing. Claire returned to her spot at the microfiche, while the other woman took out a book from her bag and began reading, seemingly stalling for time. Claire continued working for another hour before signaling she was done for the day, gathering her notes and personal belongings. Once I had to step out to the restroom, fearing they might leave while I was away. But the timing was right, and I didn't miss anything. As she got up to leave, the other woman also started packing up. Before departing, they kissed again, and holding hands, left the building. Upon reaching the parking lot, they parted ways and headed to their respective cars. I lingered in the back lot until they began moving, then slipped behind them, as they both went in a direction opposite to our home. They seemed not to notice me as I followed, keeping a respectful distance behind them. Traffic was busy, and there were few traffic lights, but we were not headed towards our house. About 20 minutes later, they pulled into a residential complex and parked. Exiting the car, they walked towards one of the buildings while I settled in to wait. After about 2 hours, I saw Claire leave the apartment, get into her car, and drive off from the parking lot. I followed again until I was sure she was heading home, then went to grab a bite and contemplate what I had seen. What was happening? Who was this woman? Was Claire having an affair with her? And finally, how could I get answers to my questions? While eating, my thoughts were somewhat jumbled, but it all boiled down to whether I should hire a detective to get answers or do it myself. Eventually, I decided to try getting information on my own, so after finishing lunch, I headed to the nearest Radio Shack store and bought 3 battery-operated sound-activated micro-cassette recorders. They were quite expensive, but I figured it was cheaper than hiring a detective. By the time I had purchased everything, it was close to my usual time to return home from work, so I headed to the car rental agency and retrieved my own car. Arriving home, Claire greeted me with a kiss and a hug. "Darling, freshen up and fix yourself a drink. Dinner will be ready in about half an hour," she said, heading back to the kitchen. After fixing my drink, I went to the kitchen. "How was your day?" I asked. "Fine. I got quite a bit of work done at the library in the morning, and after lunch I worked on the book. Same old, I suppose," she replied. "Did you hear from anyone? Did Mom mention they're planning to visit?" "No, it was a quiet day. Didn't talk to anyone. If I hadn't known better, I would have taken her word without question. She didn't blink as she spoke and told me lies. In the past, I thought I could entrust her with my life, but now, that trust might vanish. Our entire marriage now seemed built on lies and potential infidelity, even if it was with a woman." I stepped back into the living room before saying anything. When I confront her, I'll need all the facts. "How was your day?" she asked, entering the living room. "As usual. I wasn't in the office most of the day. Worked on a project," I mentioned, just in case she called the office looking for me. "Dinner's ready if you want to sit." As we ate, she told me she was meeting Professor Holcomb the next day in his office to discuss the final chapter of her book. She was nearly ready to send the package to the publisher, and she was excited. I just nodded and said I'd keep my fingers crossed for her. After dinner, I cleared the dishes in the kitchen, and she went back to her room to work on the book. When I finished, I took one of the recorders to the garage and placed it under the driver's seat of her car. I made sure it was hidden, but easily accessible. Then I took another recorder and placed it in the lining of her purse. I held on to the third one to set up in her room in case she made calls from there. After that, I watched TV until around 10 and knocked on the door of her room. "Sweetheart, I'm going to bed to read for a bit. Will you be joining soon? I want to finish this chapter to take it to Professor Holcomb tomorrow, so I might be a while. I'll join you as soon as I can." "All right," I replied, and went to bed. I read for a while but couldn't stay awake and drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time she came to bed, as I was fast asleep. The next morning when I left for work, she was still fast asleep. I planned to let the recording devices keep tabs on me for a while. When I returned home that evening, I waited until after dinner in her retreat to her room, then went to the garage and checked the recorder in her car. I wasn't surprised to find it mostly empty in terms of conversations. Then I found her purse and listened to the recorder hidden inside using headphones. Again, nothing out of the ordinary, just her conversation with Professor Holcomb about her book. It seemed like nothing else interested them. So, I erased the recording and put it back in place. I'd have to wait to check the recorder in her room. This evening repeated the previous one, and I ended it by going to bed alone again. The next morning, I woke up early and slipped into her room to retrieve the last recorder. There was an interesting but brief one-sided conversation on this recorder. First, I heard a dial tone, indicating Claire was making a call. "Hi, it's me," I heard my wife's voice. "Are we still on for tomorrow?" I couldn't hear the voice on the other end very well, but it seemed to be a woman. "Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too, but I'm a little worried. Jim's been acting strange. Do you think he suspects anything?" "No, I'm not planning to leave him yet. Thanks for the offer. I need to get this part of the book to the publisher and get their commitment before I decide to leave him. I still need his support for a while. I'll be glad when we can be together fully. These twice-a-week attempts barely satisfy me. I'm glad I'll get to see you for a few hours tomorrow. It's been hard, trying to be close with Jim just to keep him content. I don't really get as much pleasure out of it as I do from being with you. All right, I love you too. See you tomorrow at the library. I was stunned. Everything became clear to me, what she was doing and what her plans were. I thought I loved this woman and she loved me back, and now she was just using me to feed, clothe, and keep the house while she wrote her book and indulged in lesbian affairs. How little I knew this woman after all the years of our marriage. I hastily erased the recording, hid the recorder again, then went to work, utterly shaken by her betrayal. At work, I sat in a daze for about an hour, then decided I needed impartial advice on how to proceed with my marriage. It was evident it was doomed to divorce, but I needed to protect myself financially before that happened. I got the name of a divorce lawyer from a friend who had just been through a tough divorce, called, and arranged to meet the next morning. I wanted to listen to the recorders again to see if I could gather more data to pass on to the lawyer. That evening, I learned that the recorder from her purse became the final nail in the coffin for our marriage. The recording began in the library, it seemed, briefly. Okay, I'm almost done. I just need to pack up, and we can head to your apartment. God, I need you so much. I heard Claire's voice. Another woman's voice replied, Let's hurry, it's getting late, and you want to be home on time. It was quiet for a while until it started again. They must have been at another woman's apartment. Faster, take it off, I need you so much. Claire sounded like she was speaking. It was quiet again. Then suddenly, Don't stop, don't stop. Let me do you now, then you. This went on for quite a while. Then everything stopped as they clearly dressed. And then there was silence. I figured I had enough info, so I didn't bother hiding the bugs. Instead, I made 3 copies of the content, tucked 2 sets into my briefcase, and packed the third to hand over to the lawyer. I hit the hay without a word to Claire. Not my usual move, might have raised a flag, but I didn't care. I needed to wait for tomorrow's lawyer chat before facing Claire. Took me a while to drift off, pondering how things stood for Jim Holcomb with his divorce. That dinner scene really opened my eyes, but I was still puzzled why Claire and the professor's affair hadn't surfaced. I dozed off again before Claire came to bed. Next morning, I swung by work and after a chat with the boss, made my way to the lawyer's office. His secretary whisked me right into his office, and I spent about 15 minutes laying out the situation with my wife. I also let him listen to the recordings of her chats with her lover. When I finished, he hit me with some questions. About this book your wife's working on, any idea if it's gonna sell? Never read it, but she's been collaborating with Professor Holcomb from the English department at the university, and as far as I know, he's pretty impressed. She's sending off a few chapters and an outline to a publisher now, so I figure that'll give her an idea if it'll sell. Were you her sole support while she was working on the book? Yeah, she quit a good job a couple of years back to work on it full-time, and I've been backing her 100% financially and I guess emotionally. What do you want out of this? Are you looking for a divorce, separation, or do you see a chance for reconciliation after some counseling? I'm set on divorce and want to make it as tough on her as possible after hearing what she told her lover. I've been toying with the idea of destroying her book, wiping her computer, and trashing all her research. I wouldn't advise doing that. It might give you some satisfaction in the short run, but you could miss out on a chance for stronger revenge. What do you mean? I asked. If the book has good sales potential, even if it becomes a bestseller, in a divorce, you could claim half of its sales revenue. I think that'd give you some solid payback and be very lucrative for you. If you destroyed all her work, she could probably rebuild it in a few months, and you'd get nothing out of it. It's definitely worth considering, but perhaps it's not such a comprehensive revenge. Well, you have to consider that it could cost you several $100,000. While she could restore her affair in less than 6 months, you might end up getting very little out of it in the end. What do you suggest? I would advise you to wait and see how her book is received by the publisher. If she asks for and receives an advance from the publisher, it's a sign they see significant potential in the book. If the advance is substantial, she might move in with her lover right away. If she does, you can proceed with the divorce. In our state, there's no fault, so we'll use irreconcilable differences as grounds and file a claim for a share of the book profits. You can use adultery as a cause, but it won't affect the outcome and will likely be much more expensive. If the book sells and she earns from it, you probably won't have to pay alimony. Also, you mentioned that she had a well-paying job before she quit to work on her book. That will also work in your favor regarding alimony. It seems I have something to think about. Could you give me a day to consider everything and then come back to you? No problem. Just give me a call and let me know. I left the lawyer's office and returned to work. For the rest of the day, I hardly got anything done, pondering my options. I really wanted to somehow hurt her for using me, but I didn't want to jeopardize getting a financial share of her book sales. Then I remembered something about Claire's parents. They were fundamentalist Christians and wouldn't take kindly to their daughter having a lesbian affair and committing adultery. If I could somehow use that as revenge, I'd get immense satisfaction once everything was over. An idea began to form in my mind. On the way home from work, I stopped by Radio Shack again and bought another surveillance item. At home, Claire and I had dinner with the meal she prepared. She told me she would send the package to the publisher the next day, but didn't expect a response, at least for a month. She also mentioned hearing that Professor Holcomb's wife was divorcing him because she caught him with another woman, and it would cost him dearly. I smiled to myself and made a remark that Claire didn't seem to like. That's what happens when you play around. I know I'd want payback if that happened to me. She paled and quickly regrouped. Why do you think that would happen to you? You think I'd play you like that? She asked boldly. Well, dear, I know you're a faithful wife as far as it's possible. Just spouses cheating on each other annoy me, and I start to get angry. You know, I'm sure you'll never do that to me, and I'll never do that to you. She quickly changed the subject. Don't forget, tonight is garbage night, and there are a few bags of stuff in the garage that need sorting for recycling. Okay, I'll take care of it. Then she disappeared into her office, and I didn't see her for the rest of the evening. While she was in the office, I installed a motion-activated mini-camera in our bedroom and a high-capacity voice recorder that I bought at Radio Shack that day. I wired it into the house's electrical system so I wouldn't have to worry about changing batteries. It also had audio recording capability. When I tested it, it worked fine, but I left it off until I put the second part of my plan into action. The next morning I got up and left before she woke up, grabbing breakfast at Denny's. Once at work, I called the lawyer and asked him to hold off on the divorce until we find out if the book will be published. He said that would be the wisest course of action. That evening, I told Claire I'd be going on a 3-day business trip next week. Later, while listening to the recorder, I heard her telling her lover, a woman named Eileen Carter, whom I found out was divorced, about my trip. She suggested Eileen come over and spend the 3 days at our house, and they could live together while she continued working on her book. Eileen agreed, and the second part of my plan fell into place. The following week, I packed up and left for the business trip, which was just a short jaunt to a town 40 miles away, where I stayed at a motel with a good restaurant. Before leaving, I talked to my boss and secretary about being out of town for a few days, and if my wife called, just tell her I'm out of town. They seemed to know something was amiss in my marriage and agreed to help. I called Claire every evening on my cell phone to avoid suspicion and just stayed close to my hotel room, not wanting to risk running into anyone who knew me, although it was unlikely. It was a dull 3 days. After 3 days, I returned home and acted as if I'd just been on the other side of the country. When I got back, Claire was already waiting for me with dinner ready. Giving her a peck on the cheek like a brother, I asked about her book. Have you heard anything about your book? Oh no, it's still too early. They've just received it. I think it'll be another 2 to 4 weeks before I hear anything. Are you worried? Yes, of course. I can barely sleep at night thinking about how it'll be received. I've been trying to reach Professor Holcomb, but he's not answering calls. I wanted to talk to him about some questions I have, but I guess with his wife and the university, he's got a lot on his plate. What's the university after him for? I asked. I heard it's because of another woman he was seeing who happened to be a student, and the university has strict policies about faculty-student relationships. He could get fired, and I wouldn't want that, she replied. I think he deserves whatever he gets, I said to her. Are you being a little too harsh? She asked, pouting. I've already told you my stance on cheaters. There's no sympathy from me when it comes to cheating, I said firmly. She looked a bit taken aback, but continued nonetheless. Well, if one partner can't meet the needs of the other, I think they should have the right to fulfill those needs elsewhere. Do you really believe that? What about the wedding vow, forsaking all others? What about discussing with the other partner to see if anything can be done? What about counseling before running to someone else? Since we're on the subject, could you tell me if I'm meeting your needs? Before answering, she hesitated and replied with a sad expression. Jim, you meet my needs more than any man. Then she turned, entered her office, and closed the door. I didn't want to press her further, as I wasn't ready to confront her, so I didn't say anything more. Maybe I had reached her. I don't know. I didn't think it mattered at the moment. I checked the recorder and the mini cameras, and as hoped, I caught them in our bed. The conversation was similar to previous ones I had heard, so now I could just sit back and wait. Over the next 3 weeks, we entered a period of waiting. Everything hung in anticipation of news about the book. It seemed like we were just coexisting together, each going about our own business. A couple of times we made love, but it felt like it was just out of pity, and with that thought, it was hard to engage in it. Finally, one day I came home from work and Claire was all aglow. Guess what? I got a call from the publishing house today. They loved my book and they're sending me an advance of $25,000. I'm so excited. They also recommended that I find an agent and gave me the names of a few people they've worked with before. I've been on the phone with them all day and it seems like I've found someone I like. That's great, sweetheart. I'm really happy for you. You've worked so hard on this and deserve some payoff. Want to go out for dinner tonight to celebrate? I was just about to suggest that. Let me go change. We went to one of the best restaurants in town and then returned home to make love. She seemed a bit more enthusiastic about it than usual, and I was pleasantly exhausted when we finished, cuddling up together and falling asleep. My last thought was to call the lawyer in the morning and initiate the divorce. When she got her hands on the advance check, I realized I had gotten myself into a mess. The next morning at work, I called the lawyer, and he said he would prepare the documents right away and file them the next day. She would be served the following day. That morning, before leaving the house, I burned a few DVD discs with Claire and her lover in our bed and sent one to the lawyer. I planned to wait a little before doing anything with the rest, and a couple of days later, I took a day off to make necessary changes to our joint bank accounts, credit cards, finances, insurance, retirement plans, and even my will and pension plans. Claire was still sleeping after another late night with her book when I left. She was supposed to be home all day, and in the morning she would receive the documents. The papers were about divorce based on irreconcilable differences and splitting all assets 50-50, including future earnings from her book. At my request, a photo from the DVD capturing her in bed with her lover was included in the document package. I wanted her to understand why I was pursuing divorce when she received these documents. Around 11 a.m., she called me. She sounded very calm. I see you figured me out. Your package arrived, Jim, and I'm sorry our marriage ended like this. I'll go to the lawyer and fight you for a share in my book. By the time you get back from work, I'll be gone. My lawyer tells me I have very good chances of getting a share of the book, but you can discuss that with your lawyer. Goodbye, Claire. I think all future contacts should be through our lawyers, so have a good life. I hung up before she could respond. Now there was one more thing left for me to do, and it had to happen after the divorce. I had to send a copy of the DVD to her parents. It was just a small act of revenge, in addition to any monetary gain I hoped to get from her book. It took about 6 months for our divorce to be finalized. There were many negotiations between the lawyers, but in the end, I received 40% of the earnings from her book, since I had funded and supported her throughout most of her research and writing. In the end, I got over $250,000 for my share, as the book made it to the bestseller list and even topped the sales charts for a month. Professor Holcomb was exposed by his wife, and despite his position, the university forced him to resign, threatening to publicize his indiscretion otherwise. He agreed and resigned. A year had passed since the divorce, and I was having lunch alone at a local restaurant when I heard a familiar voice. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up and saw Claire standing there looking at me expectantly. She looked very attractive and well put together, just as I would expect from a best-selling author. Standing up, I invited her to sit. "How have you been, Claire? It's been a while and you look great." "I'm doing well. I'm working on a new novel," she smirked. "And this time, I don't plan on sharing anything from it with you." Laughing, I replied, "I have no doubt it will be a great success." It was amusing that I could be at ease with my ex-wife now, when the emotional upheaval that was part of our divorce was long behind us. "So, how about you? Any new romantic interests in your life?" "No, just casual dates, nothing serious. I'm not in a rush to jump into the fire again." "How about yourself?" She paled a little at my remark, but continued with a smile. "I'm single, just like you. No romantic interests." "What happened to Eileen? I thought she and same-sex relationships were your thing." She seemed hesitant to answer, but after a pause, she admitted something to me. "My affair with Eileen lasted only a few months. The novelty and excitement seemed to wear off, and we broke up. Since then, I haven't been with another woman. I must admit, looking back, I realize what I gave up when we parted ways, and I'm very sorry it turned out that way. I guess I regret it too, but trust is so easy to lose and so hard to regain. I still resent you for sending that DVD to my parents. They're just now coming around and talking to me again. I suppose I just wanted to get back at you for how you played me." "I've often wondered about that," she said. "How did you find out about my indiscretion with Eileen? It bothered me a lot because I tried to keep it from you until the book became a reality." I paused for a moment to recall the moment when I first suspected something, and still felt puzzled as I responded. "Remember that party at the dean's house? It was a couple of years ago during the Christmas break." "Yes, I remember, but I don't recall anything I did there that would involve Eileen." Then I told her about my feelings regarding the professor being a womanizer, the conversation with the professor's wife, Jean, and their reaction to us talking together. Claire looked at him with surprise before responding. "As far as I remember, our reaction was because Randy and I had been talking for a while and forgot about both of you. It happened because we suddenly felt guilty for neglecting you. We weren't involved in your relationship, and certainly weren't concerned about you two talking together." "In any case," I told her, "since we misinterpreted that reaction, we went ahead and hired an investigator who discovered the professor's affair with a student, but didn't uncover your involvement with him. Later, because I still had suspicions, I hid a few recording devices and captured your affair with Eileen. So it was your and the professor's innocent reaction to Randy and me talking together that led to the exposure of two affairs and the breakdown of two marriages. How strange."